The Listening To presents Not the Headlines Extra.
You may have heard that there was a brief interruption in the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas over the weekend. The story is that 2 Israeli soldiers were killed by Hamas, so Israel retaliated. That's where it ended, and the ceasefire resumed. As was claimed later, the Hamas guys who killed the Israeli soldiers didn't know that there was a ceasefire. Well, one way to get the word out is to eliminate those who didn't get it the first time. Reports are that 36 people were killed in Israeli airstrikes to neutralize the threat. Allow me to share with you some of the headlines from newspapers around the United States, and you can decide for yourself if they tell the same story I just related to you. The Washington Times. Gaza ceasefire starts to crumble, with a subheading, Israel retaliates after Hamas kills 2 soldiers. The Washington Times is a relatively conservative publication. The headline is a little ominous, but the subhead sums up the event in only a few words. There are some who try to be centrist, like the Chicago Tribune, which says Israel halts aid after fighting in Gaza, with the subhead, Ceasefire holds as Netanyahu doesn't push return to war. And the Wisconsin State Journal, which says renewed fighting strains ceasefire, with the subhead, Hamas blames remote units, Israel halts aid. Other headlines also mention the suspension of aid, but only the Washington Times mentions that Hamas struck first. Other headlines from around the country clearly show a pattern of partisanship on the part of our print media and its digital accessories. Or at least a negative narrative of the peace deal and ceasefire and its likelihood of succeeding. Here's one from the Tampa Bay Times. Israel hits Hamas, halts aid in Gaza, with the subhead, trucks stopped until further notice as renewed fighting tests the fragile ceasefire. Simply describing the ceasefire as fragile has a purpose. The Chattanooga Times Free Press was a little more optimistic when it read, renewed fighting tests Gaza ceasefire, with the subhead, Israel briefly halts aid. But the Philadelphia Inquirer was much more bold in its description. Israel briefly halts aid as fighting restarts, with the subhead, the ceasefire shows signs of fraying as accusations are traded, escalating into deadly Israeli airstrikes. If you only read the headline, you would believe that Israel dropped bombs on people and stopped all aid without any provocation but accusations. The Portage Daily Register in Wisconsin says, renewed fighting tests fragile ceasefire, with the subhead, Israel briefly halts aid to Gaza amid deadly strikes. It doesn't blame anyone specific for the deadly strikes, and makes the interruption of aid the main story. You have to read the story to find out that the fighting isn't continuing, as the headline might lead you to believe, and that aid has been resumed. The Dallas Morning News was more to the point. Truce restarts after attacks, it said, with the subhead, Israel says peace aid to resume after airstrikes kill 26. Yes, there is a discrepancy in the number of people killed. The Roanoke Times in Virginia says, ceasefire tested as fighting renews, with the subhead, health officials said at least 36 Palestinians were killed. It doesn't mention that 2 Israeli soldiers were killed. On the Minnesota Star-Tribune, it's the top story. Israeli attacks shake ceasefire. If that's all you read, and that's all you think you need to know, and it simply confirms what you suspected or hoped would happen, then you have no reason to read the subhead, which says, Gaza aid also temporarily halted after Israel says Hamas broke truce by shooting soldiers. That sounds fair on the surface, but the headline would imply the Israeli attacks are confirmed, while the shooting of Israeli soldiers by Hamas is an allegation. It's a subtle difference, but it matters. Some of the country's headlines were more to the point. The Arizona Daily Star says, Israel strikes targets in Gaza. The Washington Post, Israeli strikes hit Gaza days into truce, with a subhead, dozens killed after IDF says it responded to alleged Hamas violation. A violation? 2 Israeli soldiers were killed, and the Washington Post calls it an alleged violation. The Reporter Times in Martinsville, Indiana reads, Israeli military launches series of attacks on Gaza, with the subhead, Hopes dim for lasting peace after ceasefire deal. The Times Mail in Bedford, Indiana had the exact same headline. Citizen Times of Asheville, North Carolina reads, Ceasefire hopes dim as Israel launches more attacks.
Well, that can't be right.
Here's the bottom line. America's reporters on the ground are doing a pretty good job of bringing the facts of the story to the editors. But it's the editors who write the headlines, not the reporters. There was a time when a headline was meant to get your attention. It was a reason to read the story. But now, headlines are written to get you to skip the story. The headline, along with the subheadline, sums up everything a busy person on the go needs to know about the story. That's why we have the media, right? To sum it all up for us? Well, yes. And it is by some pretty good reporters. Not all of them have an agenda. For those who do, the headline makes their point anyway, and the editor is happy for the content. But even if an independent-minded reporter submits a well-written and comprehensive story, the editor can still cut content under the pretense of space, and may also write a headline that is vaguely related to the content, but tells a different story altogether. In this case, newspapers nationwide chose to vilify Israel, cast doubt on the peace process in place, and sought to generate sympathy for one side while ignoring the fact that the whole thing was over in a matter of hours and started with the killing of 2 Israeli soldiers violating the ceasefire. All by the way they wrote the headline. Counting on you to not learn the whole story.
Get a lot more content from the Listening Tube with Bob Woodley podcast.